the poop with Captain Brent, who was extremely well informed for a seaman, or making myself at home with the sailors before the mast. Every hour was pleasantly employed. Winds were very favorable considering the season of the year, and we drew down rapidly towards the tropics. On the 10th of August we crossed the equator, and I brought out half-dozen bottles of wine and a box of cigars, and had the sailors, who were all smart American boys, aft. About the last of September, we passed the Cape and began to realize that we were indeed leaving the habitable world and passing into a solitude of waters whose southern boundaries were unknown. And here our real voyage began. There is a fierceness and blackness in these wild waters below the Cape that those familiar only with the ship courses of the Atlantic and Pacific, can form no conception of. Wilder and wilder grew the sea as we drew southward, but Captain Brent was an old navigator, and I feared the terrors of the whole Antarctic region not so much as a single cartoon in an American newspaper. In 151 days after leaving New York, we encountered ice, and a month later, we were sailing along the southern ice barriers that towered like sapphire cliffs as far as the eye could see in either direction. It was now summer time in these regions, and Captain Brent said he had never seen the sea so clear of ice. Whales spouted in every direction, and seafowl by thousands sailed above us or perched among the icy precipices. The grandeur of the scenery about us at this time baffles description. As we sailed leisurely east by south, there was a wall of ice on our right, ranging from 50 to 300 feet high, giving out with a splendor which no artist may portray, the gorgeous hues of the rainbow. In some places, the cliffs overhung, making great grottos in which the largest ship might float. On the 23rd of December we sighted the lofty summit of Mount Erebus, the only volcano, so far as is known, in the Antarctic regions. On the 29th, turning a spur or promontory of ice that jutted out many miles into the sea, we ran into a great cove landlocked, or rather ice-locked, where the water was smooth and where the cliffs shelved up gradually from the water's edge, reaching back and up many thousand feet, to where the opal-tinted ice shaded off into the dull gray and brown of the rugged and barren rocks of Mount Erebus. Standing on the deck of the ship and looking up the wide and irregular incline of ice that extended from the water's edge up to where the rugged sides of Mount Erebus showed above, I enjoyed one of the grandest sights ever looked upon by man. This sloping incline was broken into hundreds of terraces down which the melting snow water dashed in innumerable cascades and poured into the sea, making great banks of fleecy foam that froze and floated away, as it were, gossamer icebergs. As I gazed up this terraced incline from the placid sea to the towering heights beyond, it looked like a marble stairway leading up to heaven, so broad and grand in its mighty sweep that all the tribes of earth might mount upon it. It was a picture that Milton or Homer might have used in their immortal epics of gods and angels. The water lapping over terraces and leaping downward here and there was as white as milk, and in the distance looked like gauzy draperies of lace and down spread on the mighty stairway, as archangels might spread them for gods to walk upon. No grander sight was ever looked upon by seer or prophet in the most enraptured vision. This phenomenon, so remarkable in these regions of ice and snow, where the temperature is always below the freezing point, was caused by the heat of Mount Erebus melting the ice and snow that climbed up its sides for thousands of feet. The volcano was in a mild state of eruption, and I suppose the hidden fires on this side had melted down the ice walls and worn away this great thoroughfare to the sea by pouring down a continuous flood of water. The ascent looked accessible, and I determined to make an effort to reach the great cone and have a view of these unknown regions. We had Christmas dinner on board, after which Captain Brent read from his manual a service suitable for the occasion, and perhaps with the exception of myself, everyone on the ship yearned for home and its associations, on this day of universal joy and gladness. The boys looked blue enough until I brought out a great bowl of punch, but that soon brought them back to a state of warmth and merriment. A fine carouse the fellows had, and when I proposed to lead a party to climb Mount Erebus next day, every one volunteered to go, and my only difficulty was in making a selection. I chose 3 of the hardiest, and the next morning, with rubber boots reaching to our waists and so wrapped in woolens that we might pass a night without harm, if we could but get above the ice and water, we lowered a boat and pulled into the shelving beach, taking along an extra crew to carry the boat back to the vessel. Laying our boat alongside the ice, we had no difficulty in effecting a landing, as the water was quite smooth and in many places we could easily step out on the ice. To be continued. Synopsis of former chapters. Mr. J. E. Barrington, a brilliant and wealthy young lawyer and politician of one of the great Middle Western states, is duped and sold out by the professional politicians in his campaign for Congress, and chagrined and embittered against his country and the entire human race, converts all of his property into gold and, going to New York, purchases a vessel with which he sails down into the Antarctic regions with the intention of devoting his life and means to polar explorations or finding some isolated country beyond the pale of civilization and out of the track of sea travel where he will be lost to the world. Chapter 2, continued. To my surprise, I found the ascent less difficult than I expected. Picking out the easiest ways and keeping as much as possible out of the water, we reached a secondary cone or summit about 2/3 of the way up as darkness, or rather the twilight of the Antarctic night, closed in upon us. The surface was quite dry and warm, and I never spent a more comfortable night in these frozen regions than on this lofty peak of Mount Erebus. Getting under a ledge of rocks that sheltered us from the wind, which cut like a knife, we slept soundly without fear of mice or bedbugs. That night we witnessed the grandest display of the aurora australis that perhaps any human eyes ever looked upon before. We were 8,000 or 9,000 feet above the sea, and the luminous bands of purple and orange-colored light seemed to spring up from all around us, and as they spread towards the zenith and then dipped umbrella-shaped to the horizon, the white desolation of this frozen world was suffused with supernatural glory. As we looked out and away on the endless panorama of crags and cliffs and peaks of what seemed to be mountain ranges below us, all deathly white in this unearthly light, it looked like the ghost of a dead world. The scene was overpowering, and after a hasty survey, we were glad to clamber down into our little gorge, out of the uncanny light, and smoke our pipes, and hear each other's voices, to bring us back, as it were, to ourselves. This volcano is on the coast of Victoria Land, and in all probability, we were the first human beings who ever set foot on it. It is between 70 and 80 degrees south latitude and looking east or west as far as the eye could see, with the exception of the stairway-like slope tip which we had climbed, stretched an unbroken wall of ice. Looking southward though, with the aid of a glass, I could plainly see an open sea very much like that on the north and clearer of ice. I studied the situation carefully. Here was the impenetrable ice barrier that had baffled every explorer of these southern seas. All below this latitude was supposed to be a continent of ice and snow. Men had sailed down here and been dashed against this wall or had gone back dismayed. But here on the south was the open sea which, if it could be reached, offered to the curious navigator opportunity to go. Heaven only knew where. The more I looked at that great open sea, the more I became convinced that there was a passage somewhere through the icy wall connecting these two bodies of water. We made the descent without incident, and I instructed Captain Brant to hold a safe distance from the ice and circumnavigate the entire Antarctic Circle or find a passage through the ice. Fully imbued then with the idea that the Earth was a sphere, I supposed that this body of water on the south was simply an open polar sea, surrounded by walls of ice. The next day it came on to blow a gale of sleet and snow, and we ought northward for 4 days, through such a storm as can only age in the frozen seas about the South Pole. During these entire our days it was so dark that we could not see the topmast from the deck, though every spar and shroud was white with ice. Several times, we were in dangerous proximity to icebergs, but standing to windward as we were, we could smell the mighty monsters though we could not see them, and keep away. This smell of an iceberg, as it is called by seamen, is the peculiar crispness of the air blowing over one of these great bodies of ice and may be felt for miles. The vessel was awash from capstan to wheel, and though we could carry scarcely more canvas than would give us steerage way, her lee scuppers were most of the time dragging through the hissing brine, and it was absolutely necessary for every man above deck to lash himself to the rigging to keep from being washed overboard. Cooking was out of the question, and for 4 days there was no fire in the cook's galley, our diet during this time consisting of sea biscuit and tinned food with an occasional panicking of rum to keep up the warmth. It was a fearful time, and though we had encountered much heavy weather on the voyage, we had experienced nothing comparable with this. Indeed, Captain Brant said afterwards, that in all his 20 years of voyaging in these waters he had never passed through so terrible a gale. Only the staunchness of our ship and the skill and experience of our skipper saved us from destruction. It may not be irreverent or presumptuous in me also, to feel that an overruling providence guided us through this ice-strewn and storm-whipped sea, that the great results of our voyage might be achieved. When the terrific storm subsided and the atmosphere cleared so that we could again see about us, the towering ice barriers were nowhere to be seen. How much northing we had made it was impossible for us to tell, as we had entirely lost our reckoning. Heading southward again until we raised the ice wall along which we had been coasting before the gale, we shaped our course parallel to it and held on with the view of finding a passage through it, if there was such a thing. 14 days after this, during which time we encountered all sorts of weather, for there are never many days together in these seas without a wild snort of wind and snow from some direction, Captain Brant called me up from my cabin and, handing me his glass, directed my attention to an opening in the wall of ice before us. 2 crystal promontories jutted out into the water on either hand, and between, a narrow but well-defined and open strait. We could not see through, as it was sinuous, but after observing it for some time, we could perceive by the loose ice that was floating about the mouth that a current set into it. I instantly gave directions to have the vessel headed into the strait. In vain Captain Brant remonstrated and declared that we must be lost if we encountered an ice pack or were overtaken by a storm in this narrow place. "The wind is fair," said he, "but if we encountered an ice pack blocking the passage, as we most likely shall, we can never navigate the ship out again without more sea room." It was the first serious disagreement we had ever had since we started on the voyage, and I could not but feel that as navigator, with the responsibility for the safety of the vessel and the lives of the crew, he was right. I begged him though to lay in as close as he could to the mouth of the strait, that we might examine it more closely, and on this we compromised and put the vessel's head in towards the opening, intending to heave to and claw off the shore, as the wind was light and the sea comparatively calm. And here it did seem that Providence was furthering my apparently wild purpose, for when he had dropped the ship into within a few hundred feet of the opening and ordered the helm down to bring her about, the wind suddenly failed so that there was not steerage way enough to bring the vessel's head around, and we drifted helplessly at the mercy of the waves. Instantly all was commotion, for a ship on a shore without wind is in as perilous condition as a steamer with a broken wheel. The bow anchor was quickly cleared and the lead cast, but there was no bottom, and so to cast anchor would be useless. The current had now caught us, and there was nothing for it but to head straight into the opening, or be broken to pieces on the icy promontories that stood out like Scylla and Charybdis on either hand. My heart bounded as we passed between the towering ice walls, and I felt a thrill of excitement such as Columbus must have experienced when the long-looked-for Antilles lifted on his expectant vision. Chapter 3. The apprehensions of Captain Brant proved groundless. The passage was open, and though there was considerable floating ice, the current was driving it in the same direction, and we experienced no difficulty in sailing through. Indeed, it was impossible for us to do anything but go through, for after we had gotten fairly into the strait the current was like a mighty, swift, flowing river, and had there been a fair wind to go back it must have blown half a gale to drive us against such a tide as was sweeping through. I was convinced that this was a permanent strait and not merely an accidental break in the Great Barriers. The regular smoothness of the sides showed the effects of a continuous current and the abrasions of great masses of ice carried through by it. I say I was convinced then, but when on our return we found the passage in every respect practically in the same condition as when we passed through first, there was positively no room for doubt. I will not contend that the strait is always open, but I do maintain that it is a permanent